Welcome back to Shop Talk. Dan Perbanik with Chagrin River Outfitters, here once again with Jeff Liskay, SA, and Scott Prostaff, two-handed guru in the Great Lakes area. And we're going to be discussing sink tips and sinking leaders. Two different things, right?
Absolutely.
I think there's a lot of confusion there with sink tips and sinking leaders, and they are two different things. They have two different applications.
Yeah, I think that's where the rigging end is, where everybody has the most questions. They get the casting down, whatever. It's
Sure.
like, where am I in the water column?
Yep.
I think
Absolutely.
you get tons of questions, I bet.
Yeah. No. Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, and you just sinking leaders aren't going to do the job sink tips do, and sink tips are going to be a little much if sinking leaders in order. Correct?
Yeah. Our flows are runoff, so it's like it could be changed from week to week, day to day,
Yeah.
river to river.
Absolutely.
That's the way you got to look at it.
Yeah. So we'll call this tip talk.
Oh,
Right.
I like that.
All
Tip
right.
talk.
So there's so many different sink tips out there.
Right.
You got the OPSTs, Riffle Run Bucket. You got the Mo tips from Rio, which are great. You got the SA TC tips, which work fantastic. What's the right answer? And they come in different lengths: 8 foot, 10 foot, 12 foot. What's the right answer for length? What's the right answer for tips? What's the right answer for grain weight? And does it all really matter in the end? I think that it does and it doesn't, right? So talk about the different tips a little bit. What do you want to start with, lengths?
Let's talk a little bit about T material.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So they're all used, on the tips. It's tungsten coated, but
Yep.
So let's maybe just talk about what the number after the T is.
Very
I think people are like, what does that really mean? What is it? So I think that's where we should probably start.
Okay.
Don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. No, for
Yeah.
sure.
So
So with the T material, you have what, T8. What are all the different Mo tips?
so you have so basically the T is for tungsten,
Right.
but the number after it would be the
Grains per foot.
grains per foot.
Right.
And so, you have T8, you have T11, you have T10, you have T12, and every manufacturer is different. And it's within reason of the grain weight, but just think about basically that if the number's lower, grains per foot, it's not going to quite sink as much as you would, say a T18.
Correct.
18 grains per foot. It's pretty easy peasy.
Mm-hmm.
It's science, but it's not like, the European method of sink rate, either inches per second. But that's where we get that all the time with, what is T8?
Mm-hmm.
Does 8 mean it sinks 8 inches per second? No, it has nothing to do with the sink rate.
Correct.
Let's just prove that right there.
So grain weight and sink rate are not the same thing.
Not really, but if it weighs more, it's going to sink more.
Sure.
But it also gets thicker in diameter.
Correct.
So I think that's where, as we progress into this whole tip thing, and as the technology allows us, and anglers got out and realized that if it's a thinner diameter or dual density like we have now, it stays at fishing depth longer or better. You can manipulate it up and down the water column with rod position, angler position, all sorts of things compared to a T material. But there are places that straight up T material is the go-to too. So Yep, it's like you said, there is no right answer. I think once you find the tip that works for you, it's better probably to stick with it and learn how to use it properly, each tip.
Well, selection of them for sure.
Yeah.
Lengthwise, they come, 8 feet, 10 feet, 12 feet. Most of the rods we're using, like we said, we would like to use around here at 10 and a half, 12 feet. Advantages, disadvantages, what's your go-to?
So I generally speak, I like to keep everything within a real simple box. I like to keep 10-foot tips are my favorite if I'm using Skagit, and we're calling tips, which go on the end of a Skagit line. I keep within, 10 foot is my favorite. Now, if I go above a 12-foot rod to a true two-hander, I would use a 12-foot tip or longer. But in our area, 10 foot's my rule of thumb, but 8 foot's not bad either at times. And I'll tell you why. So it's not a fishing thing, But if an angler's struggling or you're struggling and you're wading really deep, because you're wading deep, the rod length gets shorter.
Right.
I'll just put on an 8-foot tip because his position of his rod might not be high enough. And all of a sudden, he's casting like a hero again. So
Sure.
sometimes it's how deep you wade or your casting style. You might find out that a longer, more torso length guy might even need a 12-foot tip.
Right.
Where a little girl like me, a little girly figure like me, I use maybe like a 4-foot tip. I don't know. I'm just saying to play around a little bit, see what works for you. But 10 foot's a good rule of thumb.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I like the 10-foot length's kind of my go-to. It just kind of works well for this area. That's a really nice tip, no pun intended, about, when you get a little deeper or a little later in the day, you've been casting all day, to shorten up to that 8-foot tip, and things just start going a little better again.
Right.
I like that a lot. And for the taller guys, maybe lengthening up a little bit, or yeah, absolutely. So you got your sink tips. They all kind of work, right? They all get your fly down in the zone and keep it there for the most part.
They do.
With all these different options in sink tips, lengths, weights, etc., how do you pick a handful that are going to work in your area for the kind of fishing you're doing?
I think that's the gray area when anglers get, is that no confidence. Because when you're swung fly approach, we don't get a lot of grabs, we don't get a lot of fish. So you're like, where am I really at?
Sure.
So my approach would always be 2 rules of thumb when I pick it, and then we'll talk about which ones I would pick. But is that it doesn't matter what the venue is that when you go to pick a tip, the sink rate, I want to be able to, if it's on the dangle, you would never want it when it's finishing swung, hung down from you, to sink to the bottom and stay there.
Sure.
Because at that point in time, it's the game's over.
Yeah, we're not fishing anymore.
Yeah, we're not fishing anymore.
Yeah.
But I will say that I have a tendency to what I call muscle the tip, which means that I would rather fish a little heavier tip than normal, because our topography, our rivers are, they're spayed, they're up and down, is with rod position up or down. If I have a heavier tip, I can just lead it up, or I can lead it or steer it, and then when I get a little deep spot, where I feel a little deeper, a little faster current, just step into it, swing it into there, and feed it into there.
Yep.
And, so I'd rather be on the heavier side
Sure.
than I would be on the light side.
Yeah.
Overall, that's my thought process of fishing. You don't want to be pricky,
Right.
where you're like, snag, pop, pop, snag, pop, pop, pop.
Yeah.
You're not fishing then.
No.
But, I hate to say it, we don't have summer on steelhead.
No.
We have migratory trout that in cold water, they don't move real far. So we do have to put it right in their wheelhouse. So we do have to be a little more slower, more methodical than normal. So absolutely.
Yeah, no, it's hard to tell exactly where your fly is, like you mentioned in the water column. If you can keep it in that lower half of the water column for the most part, I think you're in pretty good shape. And finding the tips that can do that for you,
right?
Depending on the circumstances.
Yeah, and then even too is a good fishing tip would be. So in the wintertime, in our geographic area, which is like what I call touch and go. So during the course of the swing, in traditionally swung fly approach, if you're on the West Coast or whatever, you would stay up off the bottom the entire time. But here in our area, I would like the angler some point during the course of the swing to just touch bottom one time. Or at least nick bottom, because it's so up and down, because then at that point in time, you can see it, with the Skagit head or whatever hits. At that point in time, it sort of puts the parking brake on the fly. And it just like, typical bouncing the bottom or, European nymphing, we just want to nick it one time, touch it, and then you can just relieve the pressure and let it go.
Sure.
That's sort of the way it goes. Are you going to get a few snags?
Yeah.
You're fishing where we fish. You're going to get a lot of snags, but
no
not a
doubt.
lot. But that's one way I like to just approach it. But so when a guy walks in the store, what's the go-to tips that you would you'd steer him towards? And I can tell you mine, what I would think, and see if we can compare the notes.
Yeah, no, I in the last year or so, to be honest with you, I've been a big fan of those new triple density Mo tips.
Okay.
I really like those a lot. I kind of like the way they stay. You don't get that little belly in the line. They kind of stay down in the water column a little better. You have a little better feel for them, and it's not that you don't have that floating line to sink tip. It's kind of floating, intermediate, a little sink, and then a little more sink. So it's a little smoother transition from Skagit head into sink tip into the fly. And for me, I just like the way they fish and move through the water column.
Nice. So we'd be like an intermediate type 3, type 5, or what's the sink rate you like?
Yeah, so I think, let me see, I forget what they have here. So I like, the intermediate sink 3, sink 4 is kind of what works for me. Is kind of my go-to tip.
Interesting. So my go-to tip, pretty much almost everywhere I've been, is the SA. SA makes the same thing at a sink rate.
Yep.
My 10-footer, it's a sink 2, sink 4.
Mm-hmm.
And that's inches per second.
Right.
But just like you, as technology went, it's not the hinge. And there are times you want to float sink
Right.
to get around like rocks.
Yep.
But if we're just straight up swinging, that 2-4, sometimes it's too heavy.
Mm-hmm.
But on general flows in our area, and I'm going to put a general, I'm just going to throw this out there,
yeah.
would be, say, 250 cubic feet per second.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty good average.
Yeah.
I'm going to say I'm going to go to the 2-4.
Yeah.
That's straight up. Now, if the last few years we've had winter fishing where the flows have been higher and we've been able to fish,
very
and
nice.
they get above, say, 350-ish or 400, I'm a 3-5 guy all the way.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are places that those fish are living that the 2-4 just can't get right down into the wheelhouse.
No, when that cold, high, fast water, for sure.
Yeah, so I'll go 3-5.
Yep.
And very rarely in our area would I go a full, like, sink 7.
Right.
Yep. It would have to be the Grand River or something like that where it's fairly high and you're talking flows over 650.
Yeah. But like you said, there's really no bad ones. Stick with, you mentioned earlier, maybe stick with, take the mystery out of it, stick with one company, a nice assortment of tips within that length, and figure them out. Learn how to fish them.
Right.
Yeah.
It's experimental. So the water temperature, most of our bigger runs come when the water temperature is super cold.
Yes.
So we have this issue of like they can't chase.
Mm-hmm.
They just can't.
Right.
Their migratory rainbows are coming from Lake Erie, so they just can't chase. So we have to slow it down. So sometimes I find myself fishing maybe a sink tip that's a little more aggressive than you would normally have.
Meaning heavier?
Yeah, heavier.
Yeah.
Because you have rod position and you can manipulate, the line and the Skagit head to speed the chase up or slow it down.
Sure.
But mainly just to maybe maintain bottom contact at least once during your swing.
Yep.
Just enough to let you know you're down in the wheelhouse of the fish. Not dragging, not up in the mid-column like summer run steelhead or out west, but our fish, let's face it, you're going to need to slow it down a little more.
I mean, a lot of times, I can remember, last year you and I were fishing. I think the water temps had some guys out. They were like 34.
That's
34.
pretty
They were cold.
average. Yeah.
They were chilly.
Chilly.
Yeah, and you need to give those fish a chance to see it and maybe eat it. Right?
Yeah, right.
It takes a minute.
Slush in
Yeah.
the morning, and then
Yeah.
it opens up to a little bit of a window of glimmer to catch one.
Yeah, absolutely. So sink tips, those are going to go on our Skagit heads
Yes.
most of the time, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
There's also something they call sinking leaders.
Right.
Oh, boy.
Oh,
Yeah, now we got sinking leaders, sink tips. Sinking leaders are a little bit different. And those are going to lend themselves better to single hand rods and lines and Scandi, correct?
absolutely.
Yeah.
You could start out swinging a fly with your single hand rod with sinking leaders.
Yep.
So sinking leaders are inches per second sink.
Yep.
They don't have it, they still have tungsten in some parts of them, but it's an inches per second sink rate. And then the leader, when you see it on the label, if you happen to go to a sinking leader package and you see the IPS,
Yep.
it's always at the butt section.
Yep.
So if it's 3 inches per second or if it's an intermediate, that's the back end section where you join it to your fly line. So you might have a little bit, you might change it with the weighted flyer, but that's where that sink rate's at. It's not through the tip like a tip section is.
Yeah.
So it's a little different position, but you can use it on a Skagit, but mainly on a Scandinavian line, where it is, single hand or Scandinavian line for sure. Grain
Weight wise, SA has the sonar Rio has the Versa leader,
Right.
right? And then the Rio, the sonars are 50 grains.
Yeah,
roughly.
50 grains each, all across the board, sure.
Yeah, the Rios are a little heavier, not much, but maybe 65 grain-ish.
Ish, yeah, give or take a little bit, yeah.
And they come in a few different lengths, but again, 10 foot's pretty standard.
I think so.
Yeah,
We're fishing guides.
right.
We need to make things as simple as possible
Agreed.
so our day goes smoother without any interruptions of like, oh, we're going to change a bunch of tips.
Right.
Do we have tricks? Oh, absolutely, we have tricks.
Sure.
That's why we hire guides.
Yeah.
But go-to's 10-footers,
Yeah.
for sure.
You know, I carry a few single 6-footers at times, and
Okay.
we sell 6-footers for the single hand rods.
Okay,
But again, most of the time I like the
10-footers.
10-footers, absolutely. That leads us into another thing with these sinking leaders that's very important. Again, and I bet you a lot of people don't know and run into problems with this. When you have, say, for instance, a floating tip, not a sinking leader, but a floater, you need a pretty long mono leader, right?
Yep. So this is something that is sometimes is like people don't think about it. Is that anytime that you have a floating tip on a Skagit, you have to have a traditional leader.
Right.
So that leader needs to be somewhere within the length of your rod, because you need to have that that fixed point on the water for you allowed to make a two-handed cast, a Spey cast.
Correct.
So if you have a floating leader of anything or a Scandi line floating, the monofilament leader after that should be at least the length of your rod. You can't have a 2-footer or a 3-footer. Otherwise, you'll just
going to kick your anchor.
Yep, just kick your anchor and spin around like crazy. But yes, that's pretty standard rule of thumb.
And then with the sinking leader themselves, then you're kind of okay to just put on that short section of mono.
Yeah.
Because it's sinking down there. It's creating that line stick that you need to make that cast.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's sinking tip, sinking leader, the distance of your tippet or leader, whatever you want to call it, could be as short as 14 inches to 4 or 5 foot, whatever you want it to be. But like you said, that line stick adheres it. And let's just call that the dog leash.
Right.
That's the working part. If you want the sinking line to go down, you want that fly to follow it. You don't want it to be chasing way up too high either.
Sure. And one other thing, say you're fishing your floating line or your Scandi line, and you don't have a tip on there at all. And again, that's another time where you're going to need a longer leader, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep. Just like nothing changes from your single hand line once you go floating.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
There's it gets a little complicated, but I think a lot of times we need to break things down into their simplest forms and then kind of go from there, right? So we don't overwhelm ourselves with all the different options that are out there when it comes to heads and lines and tips, etc.
Yeah, and that's the part of it where I think you go with the guide.
Yeah.
Because at this point, you can listen to whatever you want, but I think once you go with the guide can assess your skill set level and then take it to the next level, or just basically start right from square one.
Yeah.
And start you to where you're not like what we call in the weeds.
Sure.
Because I can get in the weeds real quick.
Oh yeah.
So we try not to get in that weeds real quickly.
Yeah. Come in, great for folks to come in, utilize the folks in the shop here.
Yep.
Take some of that guesswork out of it, make sure they're getting the right tips and that they need for their heads they're fishing, etc. And the areas they're fishing. Yeah, absolutely. I think that covers a lot of it, if not most of what we can do here in the shop. We'll take it a little further when we get on the water.
Oh, way better venue.
Yeah, we'll take it a little further when we get on the water. But for now, I think that was great. I really appreciate you coming by as always. That's going to wrap it up here for this episode of Shop Talk. Don't forget to check out the website, chagrinriveroutfitters.com, and hope to see you again next time.